everybody. Hope you've had a great week. This week's message about children in the Bible is about Daniel. Now, actually, when we learn about Daniel in the Bible, he's really a teenager, probably in his late teens, but he's still a young person who did amazing things for God and had amazing faith in God. I'm here in this Sunday school room where we have some things behind me from our Bible school several years ago called Babylon, Daniel's Courage in Captivity. And that means when he was a prisoner, when he was taken prisoner by a king and taken to a different country. And we have some lions here because we know the story about Daniel in the lion's den. And that was when he was in the country of Babylon. And he was taken there when he was a very young man. He was taken from his country and his family and taken captive by King Nebuchadnezzar and moved about 1,000 miles from where he lived. And Babylon is in what is now the country of Iraq. God's people had turned away from him, and God allowed the enemy nation of Babylon to capture God's people and take them away to Babylon. And the temple and the city walls of Jerusalem were destroyed, and they couldn't live in their own country anymore, so they were taken captive and taken far away to Babylon. King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon commanded that the brightest and the best captives be educated and taught to serve in the courts. He took many Israelites captive to Babylon, and he selected the best and the brightest to be trained in his court, and Daniel was one of those young men. Babylon was a very powerful empire. It was a very important country. It had beautiful palaces and temples, but they worshipped idols and they did not follow God. Well, meanwhile, Daniel and his fellow captives had to make the best of their lives in the new country. And Daniel had some friends. Their names were Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It says that they were handsome, brilliant men. They were under the special care of God, and he was using this time to train them and to help them to be faithful to him. I'm going to read you a book today that has some wonderful pictures about the story of Daniel and his friends. I hope you can see this okay as I read it to you. Long ago, there lived in Jerusalem a boy named Daniel. There had been a war in Jerusalem, and Daniel's people, the Jews, had lost. King Nebuchadnezzar had won. The new king wanted some especially bright Jewish boys to live at the royal palace and work for him. Daniel and his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were chosen. It was a great honor, but the boys were not happy to be taken away from their families and friends. Things were very different in the king's palace, and frightening. Everyone in the palace was given rich food and wine. Daniel knew that he mustn't eat or drink any of it. Long ago, God had given the Jewish people laws to help them to live better. Some of these laws were about food. Many of the things served in the palace were foods God had told the Jews not to eat. Daniel didn't want to disobey God, so he asked the servant to bring simple vegetables and plain water instead of the rich food and wine. Vegetables and water, the servant exclaimed. You won't get enough to eat. You'll look thinner than the others, and the king will be angry. Daniel said, why don't we try it just for 10 days and see? At the end of 10 days, Daniel and his friends looked much better than the others who had eaten the rich food and wine. So from that time on, Daniel and his friends were served vegetables and water. God gave Daniel and his friends great wisdom. King Nebuchadnezzar had many magicians and wise men working for him, but Daniel and his friends were 10 times wiser than any of them. They were wiser because they prayed to God and asked for God's help. King Nebuchadnezzar admitted that Daniel's God was powerful, but he did not worship Daniel's God. Instead, the king made a big gold statue and set it up and ordered everyone to worship it. This is the big statue here. It said it was 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide. The king said, as soon as you hear the sound of the harps and horns and pipes and drums and every kind of music, you must fall flat on the ground and worship the statue. Whoever does not will be thrown into the fiery furnace. Everybody was afraid of the furnace and did as the king said, except Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They would not worship the king's statue because they worshiped only God. King Nebuchadnezzar was furious and gave orders for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to be thrown into the fiery furnace. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego walked right through the flames and weren't hurt at all because God sent one of his angels to keep the fire from burning them. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was amazed and said, there is no other God who can save like this. The years went by. Another king took Nebuchadnezzar's place. God had blessed Daniel and his friends with so much wisdom and power that other men became jealous of them. One day, these men thought of a scheme to get Daniel into trouble. They said to the king, you should make a law that anyone who prays to anybody but you, O king, should be thrown into the lion's den. The king foolishly did as they suggested. Then the jealous men told the king that 3 times every day Daniel went to the upstairs room of his house and prayed to God. Even though he liked Daniel, the king had to enforce the law he'd made and have Daniel thrown into the lion's den. The lion's den was a deep pit, and the lions who were kept there didn't like it, so they were always in a bad mood. They were very ferocious. But at the moment when Daniel was thrown in with the roaring lions, God sent one of his angels, and the angel kept the lions from hurting Daniel, just as the angel had kept the fire from burning Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Daniel went back to the palace and his work, and his enemies were thrown into the lion's den. Daniel lived a long time and was a great man and a prophet. God took care of him and blessed him, and Daniel loved and served God. Just like we've seen it with several of our stories about children in the Bible, that things they learned as young people served them very well as they grew older and as they served God in mighty ways as they got older. So what do we learn from the story of Daniel? First, he was faithful to God. He didn't eat the food that was offered to him. He stayed faithful to God's laws about food and about right living. He was also faithful to God even when he knew he might die for his faith. And he was thrown into the lion's den, but he stayed loyal to God, and God protected him there. He also prayed faithfully to God. We saw that it said he prayed 3 times a day, faithful even though it might mean he would die. And God used Daniel in a mighty way in a very powerful kingdom. Does this remind you of somebody else that we studied about? What about Joseph? Joseph was also used in a mighty way with a very powerful Pharaoh in Egypt. So God prepared Joseph and he prepared Daniel to be used, even though he worked and lived with wicked kings and kings that didn't serve God. God still used him in wonderful ways. I'm going to close by reading what King Darius said after Daniel came out of the lion's den unhurt. It says, then King Darius wrote to all the nations and peoples of every language in all the earth, may you prosper greatly. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom, people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. Amen.